Imagine, if you will, a historical plot twist so massive, so seemingly improbable, that if you pitched it as a script to a Hollywood studio, I mean, the executives would just laugh you out of the room.
Oh, absolutely. They'd say it's totally unbelievable.
Right. So picture the geopolitical landscape of the early 7th century. The ancient world is just utterly, entirely dominated by two reigning superpowers.
The titans of late antiquity.
Exactly. In the West, you have the Byzantine Empire, which is, the direct inheritor of Rome, projecting this immense power from Constantinople.
Right.
And then in the East, you have the Sassanid Persian Empire, which is this absolute behemoth that has ruled for centuries.
Yeah, these aren't just large countries. They are ancient, entrenched titans.
They have massive professional armies, heavily armored cavalry, centuries of highly complex bureaucracy, and treasuries just overflowing with the accumulated wealth of antiquity.
Right. They basically own the known world.
But then, and here is the crazy part, within the span of just a few decades, both of these ancient empires are either completely dismantled or just severely crippled.
It is, without exaggeration, one of the most astonishing geopolitical shifts in all of recorded human history.
Yeah.
You are looking at a scenario where, in roughly 3 generations, a collection of Arabian tribesmen moved from the absolute arid periphery of the civilized world to literally occupying the palaces that ruled it.
It's wild to even think about.
It really is. They deposed kings, they shattered these ancient institutions, and they began imprinting an entirely new language, a new culture, and a nascent religion upon millions of people.
Millions.
Yeah, stretching all the way from Spain to Central Asia.
And the force that toppled these giants, it didn't come from another massive empire. It emerged from the harsh, sparsely populated deserts of Arabia.
Right.
A place that the Byzantines and the Persians largely considered, well, a desolate backwater. They barely thought it was worth conquering.
They completely ignored it.
Yeah, it's an underdog story that literally redraws the map of the world. And that is the monumental shift we are exploring with you today. We are taking a deep dive into the actual historical mechanics of how Islam was born.
Yes.
We want to understand it not just as a spiritual movement that changed the religious landscape, but as a sprawling, highly effective empire.
And to do that, we are using a remarkably dense, incredibly detailed source text. It's an excerpt from the New Cambridge History of Islam.
Great book.
Specifically, we're looking at a chapter covering the critical years of 600 to 705 CE, authored by the historian Chase F. Robinson.
Right.
It's a masterful piece of scholarship because it forces the reader to really confront the profound difference between history as it is remembered by the faithful and history as it can be reconstructed by the historian.
Which brings us to the mission for this deep dive. We are going to strip away the centuries of myth. The religious polemics, the romanticized legends, and the theological assumptions. We want to look at the hard historical, archaeological, and documentary evidence of this period. How did a merchant from Mecca set in motion a chain of events that conquered half the known world?
And we should establish our analytical framework right out of the gate here. We are not here today to debate theology or divine providence.
Right, that's not what we do.
If you read the traditional theological answer for why the Islamic conquests were so incredibly successful, and it's fascinating, by the way, to note that this answer is actually shared by both early Muslim chroniclers and early Christian writers who lived through it.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The explanation is simply that God willed it. The Muslims believed God was rewarding them, and the Christians believed God was punishing them.
I mean, it's the ultimate historical conversation stopper.
Totally.
If God did it, there is nothing left to analyze about troop movements or tax policy.
Precisely. But as the author of our source text points out, historians have to content themselves with describing and explaining the conduct of men. The text uses a wonderful phrase for this, actually. It says, "We must write history without the benefit of divine intervention."
I love that.
So we're going to examine human actions, environmental pressures, shifting economics, and cold, hard, pragmatic politics. We're looking at the fusion of intense religious belief and aggressive political action.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even talk about Muhammad or the conquests, we run into our first major hurdle, and honestly, it is a massive one.
It really is.
If we want to understand the birth of Islam, we obviously have to rely on historical sources. But studying this specific period, the early 7th century in Arabia, is famously, notoriously difficult.
Yes.
The text calls it a massive historiographical problem. Why are we so in the dark about an event that completely changed the world?
Well, the problem isn't necessarily a lack of material. It's the nature of the material. It is the defining dilemma for literally any historian working on early Islam.
Mm.
If we want to reconstruct the events of the 7th century, we essentially draw from two different buckets of sources, and both of them are deeply, fundamentally flawed for our purposes.
So what's the first bucket?
The first bucket is the internal Islamic tradition. This encompasses the Sirah, which are the biographies of the Prophet Muhammad, the collections of his sayings and actions known as the Hadith, and the massive multi-volume historical chronicles.
I mean, that sounds like a gold mine, though. If we have volumes of biographies and historical chronicles, what's the issue?
The issue is time. These internal sources are incredibly voluminous, yes, but they were almost exclusively written down in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we're talking about documents compiled well over 100, sometimes 200 years after the events they describe.
Which means we aren't reading the diaries of the people who actually rode out of Medina.
No, not at all.
We are reading their great-great-grandchildren's version of what happened.
Exactly. And think about what happens to a society over a century and a half of massive imperial expansion.
Right. Things change.
A lot. By the time these histories were finally being codified and written down, the Muslim community was no longer a small, desperate band of believers in the desert.
Yeah.
They were the administrators of a vast, incredibly wealthy, multi-ethnic empire. And more importantly, that empire was already deeply fractured by internal political rivalries and fierce theological debates.
So the risk is that an 8th century historian who might be, like, employed by the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad is going to write a history of the 7th century that conveniently justifies his boss's claim to the throne.
You hit the nail on the head. They are projecting their present realities backward.
That makes total sense.
It's exactly the problem. They project their 8th and 9th century political factions, their refined theological orthodoxies, and their own religious polemics backward onto the murky origins of the 7th century.
Wow.
It is an idealized history designed to answer the legal and theological needs of a mature empire, not necessarily to record the messy, pragmatic reality of a nascent tribal movement.
It's like trying to learn the true, unfiltered history of the American Revolution by only reading campaign speeches written by politicians in the 1950s.
That's a great analogy.
The core characters are there, but the motivations have been completely sanitized and repurposed. So, okay, if the internal sources are compromised by time, what about the second bucket? You mentioned external sources.
Right, so the external sources are the accounts written by non-Muslims, mostly Greek-speaking Christians in the Byzantine Empire, and Syriac-speaking Christians or Jewish populations living in the Levant and Mesopotamia.
Okay.
The great advantage here is that many of these documents are contemporaneous. They were actually written in the 630s and 640s, exactly when the conquests were unfolding.
But I'm guessing they weren't exactly objective journalists.
Oh, far from it.
Yeah.
Their disadvantage is extreme bias, and perhaps even more crippling, a profound ignorance of Arabian geography, society, and culture. You have a Greek monk sitting in a monastery in Palestine, watching his entire world burn down around him. He is looking at these conquering Arabian armies purely through the lens of biblical prophecy and apocalyptic fear.
He doesn't know what a Muslim is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He doesn't know the nuances of Meccan tribal politics. He fundamentally misunderstands the religious and cultural dynamics happening deep within the Arabian Peninsula.
So we are trapped. We're caught between an internal tradition that knows the culture but was written centuries too late and an external tradition that was written at the right time but by people who had absolutely no idea what they were looking at.
That is the historian's dilemma in a nutshell. And this dilemma forces us to rely heavily on epigraphy, inscriptions carved into stone, and archaeology to fact-check the literary texts.
Which brings us to one of the most pervasive myths that our source text systematically dismantles. And that's the concept of the Jahila.
Yes, the age of ignorance.
Right. If you read the later Islamic traditions, they describe the pre-Islamic history of Arabia as this incredibly dark, backward era. The narrative paints a picture of pure, isolated, barbaric polytheism.
People worshiping rocks and trees.
Yeah, completely cut off from the light of the divine right up until the exact moment Muhammad receives his first revelation.
That is the traditional narrative, and it serves a very specific theological purpose. If you want to emphasize the brilliant, miraculous light of Muhammad's revelation, you need to paint the background as utterly, hopelessly dark.
That makes sense from a storytelling perspective.
Right. The theological argument is that the pure monotheism originally implanted in Arabia by the biblical patriarch Abraham had been completely perverted into paganism over the centuries.
But the hard historical and epigraphic evidence we have tells a much more complex, nuanced, and honestly, a much more interesting story.
It really did.
I want to dig into that evidence because the text gives us some amazing physical proof that completely contradicts this idea of an isolated pagan bubble. We are talking about actual inscriptions carved into rocks in South Arabia, down in modern-day Yemen.
The epigraphic evidence from South Arabia is critical here. Researchers have cataloged thousands of inscriptions, and what they reveal is a massive religious shift occurring well before Muhammad.
Really? Like how early?
By the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, the old pagan pantheons, astral deities, the local tribal gods, they were being actively eclipsed. The inscriptions show that the local populations and their rulers were increasingly dedicating their texts and their buildings to a single supreme deity.
And the name they use for this deity is what really caught my attention in the text. They called him Al-Rahman, which translates to the merciful.
And any listener familiar with Islam will instantly recognize the significance of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Al-Rahman becomes one of the principal foundational epithets used for God in the Quran. Every chapter of the Quran, save one, begins with the invocation, "In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Ar-Rahman, Al-Rahim."
Wow.
This tells us that the vocabulary of monotheism was already deeply embedded in the Arabian landscape long before the 7th century.
And it wasn't happening in a vacuum either. The text outlines how southern Arabia was a hotbed for competing monotheistic superpowers.
Yes, it was very active.
You have the town of Najran, which was a massive center for Christianity from the 5th century onwards. You also had local kings in the south converting to Judaism, creating a powerful Jewish kingdom in Yemen.
And the geopolitical tension between these monotheistic factions led to actual boots-on-the-ground warfare.
Right.
We have historical records of an Ethiopian Christian invasion of Arabia in the 6th century. The Christian kingdom of Aksum, which was situated across the Red Sea in modern-day Ethiopia, actually invaded Yemen.
I had no idea about that.
Yeah, they were led by a ruler named Abraha. And Abraha didn't just conquer the south. He marched his armies into the western part of the peninsula, the Hijaz, which is the exact region where Mecca is located.
So we have a fiercely militant Christian imperialism marching right into the heart of the so-called isolated Arabian desert. This completely shatters the image of Arabia as a sealed-off snow globe of paganism.
It really does.
It sounds more like a porous borderland sandwiched between massive, aggressive, monotheistic empires. You have Byzantium to the northwest, pushing Christianity, the Sassanid Persians to the northeast, pushing Zoroastrianism and managing large Jewish populations, and Aksum to the south.
The concept of a porous frontier is exactly right. Arabia was essentially the strategic and cultural hinterland of late antiquity.
Okay.
On the eastern edge of Arabia, along the Persian Gulf, the Nestorian Church, the Syriac-speaking Church of the East, had established complex ecclesiastical organizations, bishoprics, and monasteries. If you look at the entire periphery of the Arabian Peninsula, monotheism wasn't just a religious idea. It was becoming the compelling prestige language of political expression. If you wanted to be taken seriously as a ruler, you aligned yourself with a supreme god.
Which fundamentally reframes how we have to look at Muhammad's message. If monotheism is already saturating the borders and creeping into the cultural groundwater of Arabia, then Muhammad wasn't introducing a totally alien, incomprehensible concept to a population that had never conceived of a single god.
No, he was not. The source texts suggest a regional atmosphere where the old pagan gods were growing increasingly irrelevant.
Right.
The traditional tribal deities were localized. They couldn't offer the kind of universalizing transcendent authority that a supreme god could. Consequently, charismatic figures were stepping up in various parts of Arabia to articulate a new monotheistic vision.
The text even mentions other individuals claiming prophecy around the exact same time as Muhammad.
Yes, the Islamic tradition itself acknowledges the existence of other prophetic claimants, often referred to pejoratively as false prophets.
Like who?
The most famous is Musaylima, who operated in Central Arabia. He was also preaching a monotheistic message, and he was even delivering his revelations in a form of rhymed prose, very similar to the style of the early Quran.
That's fascinating.
It proves that the idea of a prophet receiving divine rhymed revelation from a single supreme god was a recognizable cultural phenomenon in late antique Arabia.
It makes Muhammad's specific theological argument much more precise, then? His primary charge against the Meccan elite wasn't that they were totally ignorant of a supreme creator god, it was that they were committing shirk.
Exactly. Shirk is the concept of association.
Right.
Muhammad was accusing the Meccans of associating lesser polytheistic deities, angels, localized tribal gods, intercessors with the supreme god. He was demanding a radical, uncompromising purification of a monotheistic idea that they were already on some level familiar with.
So, if monotheism was already in the air, what were the specific cultural and linguistic ingredients Muhammad was working with to build his movement? This leads us directly to the life of Muhammad himself and the language of the Quran.
A crucial topic.
And I have to say, as someone who loves reading historical biographies, the source material here is incredibly frustrating. We actually know almost nothing about Muhammad's early life in Mecca that we can confidently call hard historical fact.
It is a profound historical blank spot,
Yeah.
and for a very specific reason. The early Muslims who were preserving these memories were intensely, almost exclusively focused on what Muhammad became, the chosen messenger of God. They were vastly less interested in who he had been before the revelations began. Consequently, almost everything we have about his childhood and early adulthood was generated much, much later, and it was generated to serve specific theological needs.
The text points out that even his birth year is up for debate. The famous traditional date of his birth is 570 CE. It's known in the tradition as the Year of the Elephant, and it's tied directly to that Ethiopian Christian invasion by Abraha that we just mentioned, because Abraha's army supposedly included African war elephants.
It is a highly dramatic, memorable historical marker.
Totally.
The tradition states that Muhammad was born in the very year God miraculously destroyed this invading Christian army to protect the sanctuary of Mecca. But, as our historian author points out, when we look at the external historical records and the epigraphic evidence concerning Abraha's campaigns, 570 is simply too late.
Really?
Yeah. If Muhammad was born during the era of that invasion, it would have to have been somewhere in the 550s.
So the later historians tweak the date to align his birth with a massive, miraculous display of divine protection. That highlights a really important mechanism in how early Islamic history was written. The text refers to it as generated history.
Generated history is a crucial concept.
Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. As the Muslim community expanded and generations passed, the Arabic of the Quran, which is highly elliptical, poetic, and often lacks contextual explanation, began to become obscure.
They didn't understand their own text.
Well, later Muslims needed to understand exactly what certain vague verses meant. So to explain a confusing verse, storytellers and early exegetes would generate a historical narrative, a backstory, to provide the context. Over time, these explanatory stories hardened into accepted biographical facts.
The text gives a stunning example of this with the story of the birds. There are these incredibly vivid, later biographical accounts of Muhammad as a young child.
Yes, very famous story.
He is out in the desert, and two supernatural, eagle-like birds descend from the sky. They pin him down, literally open his chest, remove his heart, extract two black clots of blood representing sin, wash his heart, put it back, and reseal his chest, marking him with a physical seal of prophethood.
It is a beautifully visceral, intense narrative. But as historians, we have to recognize the mechanics at play. This story was almost certainly generated to explain its specific metaphorical verse in the Quran, Surah 94.
Okay.
That verse asks, "Did we not expand your breast for you and relieve you of your burden?" The later tradition took a poetic metaphor about spiritual comfort and literalized it into a miraculous physical surgery.
Wow. They needed to show that he was physically purified and chosen from birth, placing him firmly in the long, miraculous chain of biblical prophets.
Exactly. And another deeply entrenched narrative from this period that serves a similar theological function is the absolute dogma of Muhammad's illiteracy.
Wow.
The traditional stance is that Muhammad could neither read nor write.
I want to push back on the historicity of that, because the text explains exactly why that dogma was so necessary. If you are preaching a new monotheistic scripture in a world already crowded with Christians and Jews, you are going to face accusations of plagiarism. And indeed, the external sources accused Muhammad of just having someone read him the Torah and the Gospels so he could copy them.
The accusation of human transmission was a major threat to the legitimacy of the revelation. Insisting on Muhammad's complete illiteracy functioned as an impenetrable shield against those claims.
That makes total sense.
If the man could not read a single word, then the linguistic majesty and the complex biblical knowledge contained within the Quran could not possibly be the result of a human being studying old texts. It had to be a direct, unmediated miracle.
It framed the Quran itself as the ultimate proof of his prophethood. Moses had a staff that turned into a snake, Jesus healed the blind, but Muhammad's miracle was the transmission of God's perfect, inimitable speech through an unlettered mind.
Beautifully put.
But here's where the source text throws a massive curveball. The author introduces a linguistic theory that challenges this idea of absolute isolation from other religious texts. It's the theory of the Syriac substrate.
Ah, yes. This is a highly controversial but incredibly fascinating area of modern academic research into the origins of the Quran.
Let's get into it.
So, the traditional view is that the Quran was revealed in a pure, unadulterated classical Arabic, entirely insulated from outside linguistic corruption. But philologists who study the text note that the Arabic of the Quran accommodates a surprisingly wide range of non-Arabic loanwords.
Okay.
The Syriac substrate theory suggests that there is a deep underlying Syriac Christian linguistic influence buried within the Arabic text itself.
Wait, pause. You're telling me that for over 1,000 years, millions of people have been reciting these specific chapters in what they believe is pure Arabic, and now modern historians are saying they might be misinterpreting the language entirely?
Well, yes.
That is a massive claim. What is the actual proof for this? Are we saying the Quran is partly Aramaic?
Not that it is written in Aramaic, but that it utilizes the vocabulary and conceptual frameworks of Aramaic, specifically the Syriac dialect.
Okay, got it.
Syriac was the primary liturgical and theological language of Eastern Christianity in late antiquity. And we already established that Arabia was geographically, economically, and culturally contiguous to the heartland of Syriac Christianity in Syria, Mesopotamia.
Right, the borderlands.
Exactly. It is entirely logical, inevitable even, that severe linguistic cross-pollination occurred. In fact, foundational Islamic terms like Quran, which means recitation, and surah, the word for a chapter, are recognized by linguists as being Aramaic in origin.
Okay, that makes logical sense, but the text gives a specific example that is just mind-bending. It's about Surah 108, known as Al-Kawthar.
Yes.
This is one of the shortest chapters in the Quran. But the author points out that if you try to read this chapter purely through the strict rules of classical Arabic, it is notoriously confusing and disjointed.
It is a famous puzzle for Islamic scholars. In a pure Arabic reading, the surah talks about being given abundance. It commands the believer to pray and make animal sacrifices, and then it abruptly ends by stating that an enemy will be disinherited or left without posterity.
That doesn't really flow.
No, it doesn't. Even the greatest medieval Muslim commentators struggled to stitch those disparate concepts into a cohesive, logical message.
But the author of our text outlines what happens when philologists read it as an Arabic-Syriac hybrid. They essentially apply the meanings of Syriac Christian words that sound identical to the confusing Arabic words used in the text.
And when they do that, the meaning shifts entirely.
What does it turn into?
The transformation is striking. When viewed through the lens of a Syriac substrate, the text suddenly resolves from a disjointed puzzle into a highly coherent, beautiful piece of late antique religious guidance.
Wow.
Instead of a strange passage about abundance and disinheritance, the hybrid translation reads roughly as, "Surely we have given you the virtue of patience, so pray to your Lord and persist in your prayer. Your enemy, Satan, is thus vanquished."
I have to admit, that flows perfectly. It sounds exactly like the kind of spiritual exhortation you would expect to find in late antique monotheism.
It really does.
And I think the crucial takeaway for you, the listener here, isn't to play gotcha with the Quran. Acknowledging these linguistic roots or the Syriac substrate doesn't challenge the originality or the profound power of Muhammad's vision at all.
I completely agree. It is a mistake to view influence as a detraction from originality. It simply shows us the cultural vocabulary Muhammad was utilizing to build his movement.
Right.
Consider the historical context of Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus operated entirely within a first-century Jewish and Greco-Roman cultural and linguistic context. He used the parables, the philosophical concepts, and the language available in his environment to communicate a revolutionary idea.
Muhammad was doing the exact same thing.
Yes, he operated within the diverse, multilingual, religiously charged reality of the late antique Near East. He was using the tools available in his environment to articulate a radical message to his people.
And that radical message was uncompromising, urgent monotheism. Around the year 610 CE, Muhammad steps into the public sphere in Mecca, not as a king, but as a warner. He is warning his community of the impending last day, of the reality of heaven and hell, and of man's ultimate, inescapable accountability to a single God. And he isn't just preaching theology, he is railing against the social realities of Mecca.
He attacks social injustices, the hoarding of wealth, and practices like female infanticide.
Which, as you can imagine, made him incredibly unpopular with the entrenched power structures of Mecca. The dominant tribe in Mecca, the Quraysh, controlled the city's economic and religious life.
Right, they relied heavily on the prestige and the lucrative economic benefits of the polytheistic sanctuary located there, the Kaaba.
Pilgrims from all over Arabia came to worship various idols housed at the Kaaba, bringing trade and wealth.
Exactly. Muhammad was directly attacking the legitimacy of those gods. And by extension, he was threatening the economic foundation and the social norms of the Quraysh elite.
He was bad for business and bad for tradition.
Very bad.
Now, initially, the text notes that he was protected by the complex system of Arabian tribal law. While his uncle, Abu Talib, the head of his clan, was alive, Muhammad had physical protection. You couldn't just assassinate him without sparking a massive blood feud with his clan.
Right.
But then his uncle dies.
And the death of Abu Talib is a critical inflection point. Without the protection of his clan leader, those vital kinship ties snapped.
He was on his own.
Muhammad was officially marginalized, entirely vulnerable to the escalating persecution, boycotts, and violence of the Meccan elite. He could no longer safely operate in his home city.
He is backed into a corner, facing a life-or-death decision, and the decision he makes literally resets the calendar.
It does.
This brings us to the year 622 CE. Muhammad and his small band of followers flee Mecca and emigrate to an oasis town called Yathrib, located about 275 miles to the north. This event is called the Hijra.
The Hijra is the watershed moment of early Islamic history. It is impossible to overstate its importance. Yes, it is so fundamental to the identity of the movement that it was later chosen to mark year zero of the Islamic calendar. The town of Yathrib eventually becomes known simply as Medina al-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or simply Medina.
I want to break down exactly why moving from point A to point B is so critical, because it's not just a change of scenery. In Mecca, Muhammad was a persecuted visionary, a street preacher challenging the establishment. But when he arrives in Medina, his role completely transforms.
Right.
Why was he invited to Medina in the first place?
Medina was deeply fractured by intense, multi-generational blood feuds between its resident Arab tribes.
Okay.
They needed an outside, neutral arbitrator to mediate these disputes before the violence tore the oasis apart completely. Because Muhammad had gained a reputation for honesty and possessed a charismatic religious authority, they invited him to essentially serve as a supreme judge.
Oh, wow.
So upon arriving in Medina, Muhammad is no longer just preaching theology. He suddenly has to function as a politician, a chief magistrate, and eventually a military general.
This is where we really have to adjust our modern assumptions about religion and politics. Today, we think of them as two separate spheres, the church and the state. But the text explicitly states that in 7th century Arabia, there was absolutely no distinction between what we would call the religious and the political.
That is a vital concept for you to grasp. In this society, governance was managed through complex, overlapping ties of blood kinship, alliances, and feuds. Resources were incredibly scarce, and organized violence was a constant reality.
Yeah.
Religion wasn't a private belief system you engaged with for an hour on the weekend. It was your social identity.
Exactly.
If you confessed belief in the one God and swore loyalty to his prophet, you weren't just joining a congregation. You were actively joining a new political entity.
Yeah.
To work out God's will meant working to effect a new political order on earth.
Muhammad was engaged in the ultimate project of state building. And amazingly, we don't have to rely entirely on 9th century historians to know how he did this. We actually have documentary evidence from the time. It's a document known as the Constitution of Medina.
The Constitution of Medina is arguably the most important surviving text from Muhammad's actual lifetime.
Really? What is it exactly?
It is a pact or a series of treaties drawn up to regulate the relationships between the various groups living in the oasis. The Muslim immigrants from Mecca, the local Arab tribes who converted, and the local tribes who hadn't.
I want to focus on this because reading the details of this constitution completely challenged my assumptions about the origins of this state.
How so?
Well, the document lays out the rules for a new community called the Ummah. This Ummah is revolutionary because it's defined by a shared ideological compact rather than just blood ties.
Yes.
It details rules for mutual defense against outside attacks, how to pool money to pay blood ransoms, and how to handle internal retaliation.
Yeah.
But here is the detail that stunned me. This original foundational Islamic document actually explicitly included the Jewish tribes of Medina as part of the Ummah.
It did. Medina had a significant, deeply rooted Jewish population distributed among several powerful tribes.
Right.
The Constitution explicitly states that the believers entered into a friendly compact with the Jews. It confirms them in the practice of their religion and the security of their properties, while stipulating strict terms of mutual defense.
Wow.
If Medina was attacked, the Jews and the Muslims were obligated to fight alongside each other. It highlights a reality of early Islam that is often overshadowed by later conflicts. In its earliest stages in Medina, the movement was remarkably Catholic and inclusive.
So it wasn't a strictly exclusive convert or die club right from the start. I have to
Right.
challenge that, though, because we know how the story ends with severe hostility. How did a community that started with mutual defense pacts and shared religious practices end up violently fracturing?
To understand the fracture, you have to understand how close they were initially. As we noted, Muhammad saw himself squarely in the long lineage of biblical prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus.
Yeah.
Because of this, early Muslim rituals were closely patterned on existing Jewish traditions. For instance, the early Muslims observed a fast on the 10th day of the month of Muharram.
Which perfectly mirrors the Jewish fast of Yom Kippur, which occurs on the 10th day of the month of Tishri.
Exactly. And even more significantly, the original direction of prayer, the Qibla. When the early Muslims lined up to pray in Medina, they didn't face Mecca. They faced north, toward Jerusalem.
I didn't realize that.
Yes. The theological and ritual distinctions between a Muslim and a Jew were not yet firmly drawn in the sand. But this proximity is exactly what made the eventual rejection so devastating.
Right. Muhammad arrives claiming to be the final prophet in the Jewish and Christian tradition. But the Jewish tribes of Medina, who possessed their own ancient scriptures and scholarly traditions, largely rejected his claim to prophecy.
And that theological rejection had immediate political consequences. As Muhammad's political power and military success grew, the Jewish tribes became increasingly uneasy.
Makes sense.
The source text mentions a growing sense of Jewish schadenfreude, essentially. Elements of the Jewish tribes taking quiet pleasure in early Muslim military setbacks and allegedly communicating secretly with Muhammad's enemies in Mecca.
So you have a toxic mix of theological rejection and perceived political treason inside a besieged city.
Yes, and this tension resulted in a total ideological and political break, finalized in two distinct ways.
Okay, what was the first?
First, theologically, a revelation comes down that shifts the Qibla. The Muslims are commanded to turn their backs on Jerusalem and reorient their daily prayers toward the Kaaba in Mecca. This was a profound, visible declaration of a distinct religious identity.
And the second way?
Second, politically and militarily, the Jewish tribes were systematically eliminated from Medina over the course of several years. Following various accusations of treason or treaty violations, the Banu Qaynuqa and the Banu al-Nadir tribes were besieged and expelled from the oasis, their lands confiscated.
Wow.
Finally, following the Battle of the Ditch, the men of the Banu Qurayza tribe were executed and the women and children enslaved.
It is a brutal consolidation of power. The Ummah was no longer a loose confederation of mutual defense. Its boundaries were now exclusively and rigidly defined by total loyalty to Muhammad and his revelation. But managing this newly consolidated, fiercely loyal community required resources. In the harsh, resource-poor environment of the Arabian desert, you couldn't just rely on taxing massive agricultural surpluses like they did in Egypt or Syria.
No, you couldn't.
To survive, to feed his followers, and ultimately to secure his people's right to return to Mecca, Muhammad had to mobilize for war.
Which introduces a concept that will define the history of the next century: jihad.
Let's talk about that.
It is crucial to understand jihad in this specific historical and political context. While later theologians would heavily emphasize the greater jihad as a spiritual struggle against one's own sins, the text makes it unequivocally clear that in the 7th century, jihad meant actual physical armed conflict on behalf of God.
The text points out how frequently the Quran links the concept of emigrating, leaving your home, the Hijra, with the physical act of fighting. In a tribal society where staying with your kin was the only way to survive, leaving your home and taking up arms for a new ideological community was the ultimate, undeniable proof of your belief. And the text says God promised very tangible rewards for this struggle.
The motivation was an incredibly potent fusion of the spiritual and the material. Fighting in God's cause promised rewards in both worlds.
What were they?
The immediate practical acquisition of spoils and booty in this life, and the guarantee of paradise in the next if you were martyred.
Muhammad puts this into practice by launching a series of military campaigns to assert his dominance and choke off Mecca. It starts small. The text mentions caravan raids, like the incident at Nakhla, where Muslims intercepted Meccan trade.
Right.
This was traditional Arabian raiding, but now it was sanctioned by divine revelation. But it quickly escalates. In 624 CE, we have the Battle of Badr.
Badr is a defining moment. It was a stunning, highly improbable victory where a much smaller Muslim force decisively defeated a larger, better-equipped Meccan army.
The Quran celebrates Badr as absolute proof of divine favor, literally describing ranks of unseen angels fighting alongside the Muslims to turn the tide.
But the path to dominance wasn't a linear ascent. The Meccans sought revenge the following year at the Battle of Uhud.
And that went badly for the Muslims.
Well, it was a severe defeat. Muhammad himself was struck in the face and injured, and rumors briefly spread that he had been killed. However, the Meccans made a strategic error. They failed to press their advantage and destroy Medina entirely.
Which gave Muhammad time to rebuild and rethink. When the Meccans returned a few years later with a massive coalition army to finally crush Medina, it resulted in the Battle of the Ditch.
Yes.
And Muhammad deployed a defensive tactic that totally threw the Meccans off guard. He literally ordered a massive trench dug around the vulnerable, exposed parts of the oasis.
It seems simple to us, but in the context of Arabian tribal warfare, which relied on quick cavalry charges and open combat, it was an unheard-of tactic.
Right.
The trench neutralized the Meccan cavalry. The siege dragged on, the weather turned miserable, the Meccan coalition fractured from internal distrust, and eventually they just packed up and went home.
They gave up.
They had failed to destroy Muhammad, which in the eyes of the Arabian tribes meant Muhammad had won.
From that moment on, the momentum shifts entirely to Medina. Muhammad brilliantly utilized diplomacy, conducting treaties, building alliances with nomadic tribes, and systematically isolating Mecca economically and politically.
Very effectively.
Until finally, in the year 630 CE, Muhammad marches on Mecca with a force so large that the city essentially capitulates without a massive bloodbath.
Yeah.
He enters his home city in triumph, marches to the Kaaba, physically smashes the hundreds of polytheistic idols surrounding it, and claims the ancient sanctuary for the one God.
He had successfully unified the Hijaz under a single religious and political banner. But the vital world historical point to understand is this. The dynamic of manifesting belief through military action did not simply power down when Muhammad unexpectedly died 2 years later, in 632 CE.
Exactly. The engine of conquest had been built, fueled by religious fervor, unified tribal cohesion, and the promise of material wealth.
Right.
Muhammad's death caused a brief, intense crisis of leadership, but his immediate successors, the caliphs Abu Bakr and Umar, managed to keep their hands on the wheel. They took that engine and drove it straight out of the Arabian Peninsula.
And the speed of what happens next is simply staggering.
It really is.
It defies ancient military logic. Within just 25 years of the Prophet's death, these tribal armies pour out of the desert and break the back of the Byzantine defenses in the Levant at the Battle of Yarmouk.
Unbelievable.
They capture major, heavily fortified ancient cities like Damascus and Jerusalem, and eventually sweep across all of Egypt. Simultaneously, they march east into Iraq, and in a series of massive engagements, most notably the battles of Qadisiyah and Nihawand, they utterly destroy the Sasanian Empire.
We need to pause and put that in perspective. The Sasanian Empire wasn't some minor kingdom. It had existed for over 400 years.
4 centuries, yes.
It was a superpower with a massive, heavily armored military, and it was completely wiped off the map. Gone.
Erased.
The Byzantine Empire, the continuation of Rome, permanently lost its wealthiest, most prosperous provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. How is this tactically possible?
To understand the vulnerability of these superpowers, you have to look at what they have been doing for the 50 years prior to the Islamic conquests.
Okay, what were they doing?
The Byzantines and the Sasanians had just concluded an apocalyptic, decades-long world war with each other.
I love the boxing analogy for this. Think of the Byzantines and Sasanian empires as two massive heavyweight boxers.
Right.
They have just spent the last 25 rounds beating each other to an absolute bloody pulp in the center of the ring.
It's totally exhausted.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
They are exhausted, their muscles are failing, their treasuries are completely bankrupt from funding these massive wars, and their border defenses are brittle and undermanned. They are barely standing.
Right.
And suddenly, a lightning-fast, highly motivated featherweight jumps over the ropes and into the ring.
It is an apt analogy. The Christian chroniclers of the time, trying to rationalize the sheer scale and speed of the disaster, wrote panicked accounts claiming the Muslims were attacking with endless hordes of 50 or 100,000 men.
But that wasn't true.
No. The historical reality, as our text notes, is much more modest. The Muslim armies at major empire-ending engagements like Qadisiyah likely numbered no more than 10,000 to 12,000 men.
But they were incredibly agile. Because they weren't weighed down by massive baggage trains and heavy siege equipment, they used extreme mobility, operating on the edges of the desert where the heavy imperial armies couldn't easily follow.
And this brings us to a fascinating discrepancy between the historical myth of conquest and the actual physical archaeological reality.
This is one of my favorite parts of the reading.
Right. Because when we hear the phrase massive military conquest, especially in the context of the ancient world, we immediately assume it means the burning of cities, the widespread slaughter of civilians, and total devastation.
Right. You think of the Mongol hordes leveling Baghdad or the Visigoths sacking Rome. You assume everything is put to the sword and reduced to ash.
Exactly.
But the actual archaeological evidence dug up by modern scholars tells a completely contrary story. I want you to explain this because I found this section of the text deeply surprising. What does a 7th century conquest actually look like in the ground?
Well, when archaeologists excavate ancient sites in regions like Syria, Palestine, or Iraq, they can spot a violent conquest by looking for what they call destruction layers.
Okay.
These are distinct strata in the soil filled with thick ash, shattered pottery, burned roof timbers, and unburied bodies that clearly indicate a city was violently sacked and burned.
Right, the evidence of fire and combat.
Exactly. But when archaeologists look at the mid-7th century, the exact decades of the Islamic conquest of the 640s and 650s, those widespread destruction layers simply do not exist.
Hold on. You're telling me they conquered half the known world, deposed an emperor, and shattered a 400-year-old dynasty, and they didn't break anything?
That's what the dirt says. The physical landscape, the cities, and the agricultural infrastructure were largely untouched by the violence of the conquest.
That's wild.
Furthermore, the text points out that while there was indeed a noticeable decline in rural settlement and agricultural output in places like Palestine and Syria during this broader period, the archaeological data shows that this decline had actually begun before the Muslims arrived.
From the wars we just talked about?
Yes. It was a result of plagues and the devastating Byzantine-Sasanian Wars. The conquering Arabian armies weren't destroying the infrastructure. They were actively trying to preserve it.
Okay, so how do you conquer an empire without destroying it? It makes me think less of a barbarian invasion and more of a hostile corporate takeover.
I like that.
The Muslim armies arrive, and they essentially march into the headquarters and kick out the CEO and the board of directors. They remove the Byzantine elites, the imperial governors, and the Sasanian royalty. But the vast machinery of the empire, the middle management, the tax accountants, the local mayors, and the farmers, they are told to just keep doing their jobs, keep planting the wheat, keep running the factories, keep collecting the taxes.
Exactly.
The only difference is that now, instead of sending the revenue to Constantinople or Ctesiphon, you send it to a new boss in Medina.
That is precisely what happened. The Muslims were a tiny minority ruling over a vast sea of non-Muslims. They couldn't afford to destroy the administrative machinery because they needed it to extract the immense wealth of these new provinces.
So they just co-opted it.
Exactly. Therefore, they rarely laid long, destructive sieges to cities. They mostly negotiated treaties with local civic elites, trading local autonomy and physical security for the promise of tribute and the payment of a poll tax.
Wow.
The early Islamic policy, primarily initiated by the second caliph, Umar, was remarkably laissez-faire toward the internal lives of the local populations. The peasants were left on the land.
But what is so wild to me is the massive disconnect between this relatively pragmatic, almost peaceful administrative transition and how it was actually interpreted by the people living through it.
Yes, the theological framing of these events is entirely different from the pragmatic reality.
Right.
If we look at how the local non-Muslim populations interpreted the sudden arrival of these armies, they didn't see an agile military strategy taking advantage of a geopolitical power vacuum.
What did they see?
They saw the literal biblical apocalypse unfolding before their eyes. Monotheist Christians, deeply steeped in prophetic literature, wrote that these Hagarenes, or Saracens, were a divine scourge, a punishment sent directly by God for the sins of the Christian empire.
They wrote that God had sent a mortal hot wind from the desert to destroy a sinful kingdom.
Meanwhile, the Muslims drew the exact opposite theological conclusion. For them, the sheer scale, speed, and ease of the victory was undeniable, empirical proof of God's favor. The text gives a stunning description of the moment, the rough Desert-dwelling Muslim armies walked into Ctesiphon, the incredibly opulent Sasanian capital in Iraq.
Oh, this story is amazing.
They found the Shah's storehouses thrown open. They found mountains of gold and silver vessels, priceless silk garments, and massive quantities of exotic spices like camphor.
And they had no idea what to do with it.
Right. The text notes that these Arabian tribesmen had never seen camphor before. They mistook it for salt and tried to knead it into their bread dough.
Can you even imagine the psychological shock of that? You have men who grew up in an environment where access to a single muddy water well could be the cause of a multi-generational blood feud.
Yes.
Suddenly, they are walking through vaulted palaces, wading knee-deep in the accumulated gold of an ancient empire. The text explicitly says that for the Muslims, this wasn't just good luck. This was God physically fulfilling the promise of the Quran.
He was delivering dominion and endless bounties in this world to his true believers.
It validated their entire worldview. But as history demonstrates time and time again, introducing massive, sudden, unprecedented wealth into a society is an incredibly dangerous thing.
It acts as a volatile accelerant.
Yeah. The influx of this immense wealth from the conquered provinces completely broke the traditional social and economic structures of the Arabian tribes. And that disruption led directly and tragically to the violent fracturing of the Islamic community itself.
Which brings us back to Caliph Umar ruling from Medina.
Right. He is sitting on a logistical, ticking time bomb. The wealth of the Middle East is flowing into his desert capital. How do you divide the spoils of an entire empire among a tribal confederation without them killing each other over it?
To solve this, Umar creates an institution called the Diwan.
What is that?
The Diwan was essentially a massive military registry and a centralized payroll system. Instead of dividing conquered land among the soldiers, which would turn them into farmers, and halted the conquests, Umar decided to keep the land in the hands of the state and pay the Arab soldiers an annual cash stipend from the tax revenues.
But he had to decide who gets paid what. And the principle Umar used for this distribution is absolutely key to understanding the civil war that is about to tear them apart.
Yes.
He distributed the wealth based on a concept called sabika, which essentially means precedence in Islam.
It was a system of first come, first served, based entirely on your religious resume.
How so?
Well, if you were one of the original believers who suffered in Mecca, or if you fought at the very first battle of Badr, you were at the top of the registry. You received a massive annual stipend.
The text mentions figures like 3,000 dirhams a year, which in that economy was an absolute life-changing fortune.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if your tribe only converted and joined the conquest armies later, after the heavy lifting was done, you received significantly less.
So Umar essentially creates an entirely new social hierarchy based on religious seniority. I want to emphasize why this was so disruptive. Think about the traditional Arabian tribal structure. You had the traditional tribal chiefs, the patricians known as the Ashraf. For centuries, they were at the top of the social pyramid because of their noble bloodlines, their wealth, and their clan status.
Yes.
Suddenly, under the Diwan system, a proud tribal elder finds himself politically and economically outranked by a former outcast or a freed slave simply because that outcast had embraced Muhammad a decade earlier.
It profoundly overturned the established social order. It was the classic, explosive conflict of old money and traditional status versus new money and religious righteousness.
And you have to remember, this immense friction is happening among tens of thousands of heavily armed men stationed in garrison cities in Iraq and Egypt.
Exactly. This simmering tension finally boils over when the second caliph, Umar, is assassinated by a disgruntled slave, and the third caliph, Uthman, takes power.
Uthman's background is the flashpoint here. He was an early convert, yes, but he was also a member of the Umayyad clan. This is the exact same wealthy, aristocratic Meccan clan that had originally led the persecution against Muhammad years earlier.
And Uthman's policies as caliph were a stark, highly controversial departure from the early, austere, egalitarian ideals in the community.
He was widely accused of rampant nepotism.
He was. He appointed his own Umayyad kinsmen, many of whose families had fought against the Prophet, to the most lucrative governorships in the empire.
Oh, wow.
He was accused of funneling the vast wealth of the conquests away from the Diwan system and directly toward his own family's estates.
The resentment from the early pious settlers, combined with the anger of the disaffected tribal groups who felt they weren't getting their fair share of the loot, grew intense, until in June of 656 CE, the political grievances turned deadly.
Yes.
Disgruntled Muslim soldiers from the garrison in Egypt march all the way back to Medina, lay siege to the caliph's house, and violently assassinate Uthman while he is sitting in his home reading the Quran.
This event is a monumental, catastrophic rupture in Islamic history. The murder of the caliph, the successor to the prophet, by his own Muslim soldiers completely shatters the unity of the community.
The Ummah that was formed in the Constitution Medina is broken.
Yes, permanently.
This is the exact moment the unified religious state fractures, isn't it? This plunges the young empire into what historians call the first fitna.
The first fitna, or the first civil war.
Yeah.
Immediately following the shock of Uthman's murder, Ali is proclaimed caliph in Medina.
And Ali is a massive figure. He is Muhammad's cousin, his son-in-law married to his daughter Fatima, and one of the very first males to accept Islam. He has impeccable religious precedence.
He does, but his authority is instantly and violently challenged.
Ali steps into an absolute nightmare. He just cannot catch a break. He's opposed right out of the gate by a coalition of traditionalists from Mecca, which actually includes Aisha, one of Muhammad's widows.
Yes.
They demand justice for Uthman and clash with Ali's forces at the Battle of the Camel in Iraq. Ali technically wins that battle, but the psychological cost to his legitimacy is incalculable. For the very first time, Muslims are slaughtering other Muslims on a massive scale on the battlefield.
And an even more formidable existential challenge awaits him in Syria. Uthman's governor in Syria was a man named Muawiyah, who was also a leading figure of the Umayyad clan.
Right.
Muawiyah possesses a highly disciplined, wealthy Syrian army, and he demands vengeance for Uthman's murder. He literally displays Uthman's bloody shirt to the crowds in the mosque in Damascus, whipping up intense emotional outrage.
Wow.
He refuses to recognize Ali's authority, leading the two massive factions to collide at the Battle of Siffin in 657 CE.
But the Battle of Siffin is incredibly bloody, and it doesn't end with a clear military winner. The armies literally stop fighting and agree to arbitration to decide who should rule.
Which was a fatal, irreversible political mistake for Ali.
How so?
By agreeing to arbitration, he reduced himself from the divinely appointed caliph to just another political faction leader. The arbitrators ultimately decide that neither Ali nor Muawiyah is fit to rule. Ali, as the sitting caliph, loses his mandate and his aura of authority, while Muawiyah, who was merely a governor, loses nothing and gains immense political leverage.
Ali's coalition immediately fragments. He is steadily outmaneuvered politically and militarily over the next few years until, in 661 CE, Ali himself is assassinated while praying in a mosque in Kufa.
Yes.
With Ali dead, Muawiyah successfully consolidates power, declares himself caliph, and officially establishes the Umayyad dynasty, shifting the capital away from Medina and up to Damascus.
It is a breathtaking, almost dizzying sequence of events. In less than 30 years, they go from the death of a prophet in a desert oasis to a brutal, empire-spanning civil war, resulting in a dynastic monarchy ruling from a Byzantine city.
And if we connect this political narrative to the broader history of the religion, the events of the First Fitna are not just palace intrigue. They are the crucible in which the major sects of Islam are permanently forged.
Absolutely.
The violent dispute over who had the right to succeed Muhammad and lead the community gave birth to two great, enduring opposition movements. We need to lay this out clearly because understanding these factions is crucial to understanding everything that comes after in the Middle East. So the Umayyads hold the secular power in Damascus. Who opposes them?
First and most prominently, you have the Shi'at Ali, or the Party of Ali, which we know today as the Shia.
Right.
The Shia looked at the chaos of the civil wars and concluded that leadership of the community could not be left to the messy, corrupt machinations of tribal politics or military power.
They wanted something more divine.
Exactly. They believed that divine guidance and leadership must stay within the bloodline of the prophet, specifically channeled through the lineage of Ali and Fatima. They viewed the Umayyads as completely illegitimate usurpers who had stolen the spiritual inheritance of the prophet.
So the Shia draws a hard theological line at divine bloodline and family precedence. But human nature being what it is, and given the egalitarian roots of early Islam, there had to be a faction that thought the exact opposite, that bloodline and wealth didn't matter at all.
Precisely. That second group were the Kharijites.
Who were they?
They were radical, uncompromising egalitarians who originally fought for Ali, but broke away from him in disgust when he agreed to human arbitration at Siffin. They believed that judgment belongs to God alone.
Okay.
They vehemently rejected the idea that leadership should be based on bloodlines, Meccan aristocratic prestige, or political cunning. They believed that any pious, morally upright Muslim, even an Abyssinian slave, could be chosen to lead the community.
But they had a very dark, violent flip side to that egalitarianism, didn't they?
They did. Crucially, the Kharijites also believed that any leader who committed a grave sin or compromised God's law immediately forfeited their right to rule, ceased to be a Muslim, and should be violently overthrown. They were Puritans armed with swords, and they were the ones who ultimately assassinated Ali for what they saw as his compromise at Siffin.
So you look at the landscape at the end of the 7th century, you have the Umayyads holding the reins of a massive military and administrative state, the Shia demanding leadership by divine prophetic bloodline, and the Kharijites ready to launch radical rebellions against anyone who fails their impossible test of perfect piety.
Yes, the unified brotherly Ummah of Medina is completely, permanently gone.
And yet, and this is the great paradox of the era, despite this intense, violent internal fracturing, the machinery of the empire continued to function, to collect taxes, and to expand its borders into North Africa and Central Asia.
It did. The institutional reality of the Islamic Caliphate was firmly established, even as they fought over who should run it.
Okay, let's pull all of this incredible history together. We started with a single merchant in a cave near Mecca, receiving revelations in the dark, preaching about a single God and a society dominated by polytheism.
Right.
We end our journey, just a few decades later, observing a multi-continental empire, swimming in the ancient wealth of conquered superpowers, but deeply, violently fractured from within over the question of who gets to sit on the throne of God's kingdom on earth.
And the fundamental, inescapable takeaway from our historians' rigorous analysis of the source material is this. In the early Islamic worldview, there simply was no separation between church and state, between belief and action.
Yes.
To swear loyalty to God was to actively work to effect a political order on earth. The massive military conquests were not a distraction from the religion, they were the physical manifestation of that belief.
Political success and wealth was the empirical proof of religious truth.
Exactly. The empire survived those early precarious decades, in large part because it continued to conquer.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating, provocative question to ponder long after this deep dive is over. The text states plainly that the early Islamic polity survived its own internal contradictions, largely because it expanded.
Yes, the endless worldly victory, the incoming flow of treasure, proved God's favor and kept the soldiers paid.
But think about what happens to the psychology and the theology of a society when the borders finally, inevitably, stop expanding.
That is the big question.
If your entire proof of divine mandate is rooted in constant military victory and the endless acquisition of wealth, what happens to the faith of the empire when the map can't be stretched any further, when the Byzantine and Sasanian treasures finally run out and the armies face defeat?
Does the religion collapse under the weight of its own halted momentum? Or does it have to fundamentally, radically reinvent itself from the inside out to survive in a world where it doesn't win every battle?
That is the essential defining dilemma of moving from a dynamic conquest movement to a settled, mature civilization.
And that is a fascinating deep dive for another day.
Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack the complex, often surprising historical reality behind the rise of one of the world's great empires. Keep questioning the history you think you know, and we'll see you on the next one.